lot of emotions coming out of you right now. Just tell us how you're feeling.
Definitely grateful. Definitely happy. I finished strong. It means a lot. But it was a really, really tough year. Was keeping it, pretty close. February 11th, I was put in the hospital pretty bad. I don't really remember. I woke up February 14th. I was in a coma for a couple days. It's just been a really tough year. So I had 3 seizures. I've never had a seizure in my life, all in one day. And I was when I was in the first part of the hospital, I almost punctured my lungs, so I had a bunch of blood in my lungs. So, if we're being realistic, it sounds crazy. I don't want people to think I was making excuses. I almost died. It's tough. It's tough. Last year I got 3rd, and I didn't do as good as I did last year. I kind of lost it a little bit after I lost against Antrell. It was really heartbreaking. Taking a lot of time off the mat this year was tough. I didn't see my record. I had like 12 matches this year, and it was tough. I was in the hospital for a week. Didn't stand for a week. Got like 400 cc's of blood in my lungs. I was on a ventilator, I couldn't breathe. And it's tough, when people are, not necessarily doubting me, but telling me I haven't wrestled anyone. Like, I get it, man. Like, I want to wrestle these guys. Like, I want to do the best I can. And it's tough, I tried really hard. It's just really hard, and you work so hard for something, and then you wake up in the hospital and your family's standing around you, and I'm like, what happened? And you just give yourself a second. We're gonna tell you in a second, and then you don't know even what day it is, and just for me to go, and that was February 11th, it was a little over a month ago, and to get back to where I was tough. I lost almost 15 pounds in the hospital. I left the hospital 153 pounds. The day before Ivies, I weighed 153. I got some of that weight back pretty soon. I just was, it's tough. People, I got a lot of fans, a lot of people who love me, but I want to show them truly who I am. And when I wrestle against KSAG, it's just like not that I was heartbroken. No, I'm not trying to make excuses again. Just I didn't even feel like I was there mentally. Zerban's tough. I bet he had to go. Everyone, my dad says this saying. It's like everyone's dealt a. Pardon my language. A plate of shit, and it's like no one wants your shit, no one wants my shit. You gotta eat your own shit, and it's tough. Everyone's got to go through their own adversity, and this year was really, really hard. I love the sport of wrestling, but it was really, really hard to. Still be in love with it. It's really hard. When you go to practice and you don't really feel like yourself, and you're not yourself. You look yourself in the mirror. You don't look the same. You're just, mentally, you're not even there. And just on top of it, just the mental battles. Going every day, just self-doubt. Just really bad thoughts about myself. Some really, really close points. Not to say those exact words. Like standing over that ledge. You don't know if you're gonna jump or not, and it's tough. There's a lot of people who love me, and just. I'm happy I finished strong. Obviously, I wish I could have done better. I truly believe I'm the best guy in the bracket. And it just wasn't my year. I had to deal with some scary stuff. It's tough when your school doesn't know if you're gonna live or not. Your athletic director's asking questions and they don't have any idea. You're not even awake yet. And, my coaches weren't even thinking about me wrestling for the rest of the year, and I was like, as soon as I woke up, I'm like, what can I do right now to get better? Till then, they were just like, just rest, I guess. I don't know. And again, I'm super grateful for everybody. It's just, it's scary. At some point this year, I felt like I had the world in my hands. And I kind of got struck down by God, and he showed me that it's truly not in my hands, and as much as I was wrestling well and I was confident in myself and excited, and all those things, I got put in my place very quick, and right after that, it was really hard to mentally get prepared for this. But again, I'm grateful that I made somewhat of a turnaround. Some kids would kill just All-American, and I got 5th, so it's not bad, 2-time All-American, but again, I know all of you guys know, truly, you guys know I'm better than that, and it sucks because, it's hard to forgive yourself sometimes, and I know I'm not perfect, but, you try to strive for that perfection, and it's like it's like chasing the wind. It's just like, you're never going to catch it, and again, it's hard when people are like, he's not that, it's like, you don't know everyone's story, man, and I can even take part in that. I judge people, and it's just like, you don't know what that person's been through, and it's just like, my teammates didn't know if I was going to live. My coaches didn't know. I was like, it's hard to come see your student when he's got a tube all the way down to his lungs, and they're pumping blood out of your lungs. Like I said, 400 cc's of blood in my lungs. It was about 13 ounces, and I freaked out in the hospital a bunch of times. I don't even remember. I was seizing, and one of my seizures was a minute and a half. I guess that's pretty long. I don't know. I've never had one. It was scary, and all of you wondering, oh, that kid parties, whatever. It's like they couldn't even tell me what I did wrong. They couldn't tell me what happened. I had a fever that day, and if it wasn't for some people in my life, I would probably be dead by right now. I was going to take a nap before that practice, and I probably would have seized in my bed and died. And, if it wasn't some people in my life that really cared about me, I wouldn't be standing here today. And it would have been pretty unfortunate if, ESPN had to play a big memorial service for Meyer Shapiro, returning All-American who died, a month before the national tournament. But that's not what happened. So, I didn't semi-slide. I was thinking of a caption, semi-slide, but at least I'm alive. But I'm happy I finished strong. It's hard, and again, it's hard to forgive yourself. And I know other guys can really understand that. Wrestling's really hard, and you go to practice and you have an awesome practice, and you have a bad practice, and you have these up days and down days, and it's just like you strive for perfection, and you're never going to get it. And that's been a really hard battle for me, because no discredit to those other guys. I'm better than these other guys, and it's always been hard for me to display that. If you want to wrestle me in the room, I wrestled a lot better. But congrats to the guys who made the finals. Congrats to the guys who beat me. Congrats to Kasek and Antrell. You guys were great, and it's a part of the story. I'll move on. I got 2 more tries in college. But again,
what happened? Was it from practice?
They had no idea. So it was like I said, February 11th. I was in the car with my girlfriend at the time, and there's literally some security cam footage, and sitting in the car, I had a headache. I get migraines pretty occasionally, so I was like, I thought it was a migraine, some pressure in my eyes, and she was rubbing temples in my head, and then 30 seconds later, I had my first seizure. They called the ambulance. They're driving down the road. They had to stop in the middle of the intersection because I ripped my IVs out, and I was like fighting the nurses, and they pull over and put police officers in the car to hold me down. And then when I got to the Ithaca Cayuga Medical, again, I freaked out again, was ripping IVs out, and I had another seizure, so they put a ventilator down my tube, or down my throat, and as they did that, those little fibers in your lungs, they almost punctured my lungs going down. I appreciate Cayuga Medical. I'm not the best hospital, but they punctured my lungs, and if it wasn't for another probably 10 seconds of that seizure, I probably would have had a hole through my lungs, and that would have been really, really scary. But luckily that didn't happen, and then I got medically airlifted to Strong First in Rochester. Really, really thankful for that. They had a medically induced coma for me because I was doing so bad. Actually, the first time they tried to put me down, they put me down with a bunch of fentanyl and ketamine, and I woke up 15 minutes later, and I freaked out again. So they put a bunch in me, and I was out for, like I said, 3 days, and then I woke up, and I was very mad when I woke up, and then I tried to get up and leave, and talk about a perspective change. I try to leave right away, and one of the first things I see is this young kid with cancer, and it's like I'm so angry, being there for 3 days, and it's just like that kid looks like he's been here his entire life, and it made me feel like a pretty big asshole, just how angry I was, at the world. And again, it's perspective. I think I was definitely taking a lot for granted before all this. And I was wrestling well, I thought I was really, even after all this, I really thought I was going to win. And that, I definitely was wrestling hard. You guys can't say I wasn't wrestling hard. Maybe not in the Kasek match, I wasn't wrestling that hard, but I was definitely wrestling hard on the front side. Yeah, they couldn't really tell me what was wrong. They just, they were pretty amazed how fast I recovered. I worked out. They were told me to take 2 weeks off, and then they can start wrestling again. I looked at Mike Gray, and I'm like, dude, I don't have 2 weeks to give up right now. I have, a week and a half before a conference tournament. If you go back and watch my first conference, if you watch me at conferences, I definitely look a little skinny. Like I said, the day before that tournament, I weighed 153 pounds, and then, in wrestling terms, that's pretty good. I got to just eat and drink whatever I wanted to, but again, it's scary. It's like, dang, am I going to be able to do this? I got so many people who don't know this, and I've been keeping this. This has been pretty quiet. I've been keeping this to my. And I remember I told you I had a little story for you to tell, but. Again, I'm just grateful. It's upsetting,
So they don't think it's concussion related, or
they couldn't tell me.
One day?
I've never had a seizure in my life. I had 3 in one day. I'm on seizure medicines now. Take it every day.
Was it like, are you having conversations about retiring from the sport?
No, they like, again, I'm definitely gonna take a little break from wrestling.
Because it sounds very serious.
It was really serious. Again, like, they didn't know if I was gonna live or not, and I can't wait for the people to watch this interview and be like, that kid just bullshit all of it. And I'll come out with a little post and show you some scary pictures. It's a real big perspective change. You really think you got the world in the palm of your hands, and it really brought me to my faith. It was a real, coming to God moment. Because it's just like, again, you think you got it all figured out, and then you wake up in the hospital and it's 3 or 4 days later than you thought it was, and people are looking at you like, holy crap, you just woke up. Like, we gotta get your family here. Like, they are waiting for you. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I was just in Ithaca. No, you're in Rochester, dude. Like, you're far from home. Like, we got some stuff to explain to you. And again, I'm proud of myself. It's been a long year, man. And the year started off bad. I've had a lot of head injuries, and I don't think it's from that. I think it was just a combination. Maybe I was a little sick. They said some other stuff could just. And I think it happened for a reason, and not for nothing. I think it's probably one of the most positive things that's happened to me, as negative as that sounds, as a perspective change, Like I said, I took a lot for granted, just wrestling's been really, stressful, wrestling's a stressful sport, and I always looked at it like that, and you don't have to look at it like that, and, I kind of let it get to me, later in the tournament, but it was, a real weight was lifted off my shoulders coming out of that hospital. I was like, wow, like, I don't have to do this, I get to do this, and not that I felt like I had short time, but last year was a real bummer not being a 4-timer. This year's a real bummer. I'm not going to even be a 3-timer, but again, I'm just so grateful that I get to represent so many people. My family, my brothers. I have a younger brother, Max, who passed away. I never got to meet the kid, but I always think he's with me when I wrestle. And just to represent all that, that seal on my chest. You talk about that family aspect, and it's just, turn around, there's another one of my brothers right there, and it's just. It's truly amazing how awesome this sport is, because as much as this sport has nothing to do with deserve, it's just like you can get the real short end of the stick and still come out with a lot. It's just tough, man. Like, again, I'm really grateful for all of you guys. I'm grateful for FloWrestling, USA Wrestling, everyone. Win Magazine. Just it's a lot. It's like, again, people. Oh, you broke my heart that you lost. It's like, oh well, sorry. Oh well, man. It's just like. I tried really hard, putting the weight back on was hard, mentally was really the hardest part. I think I could have weighed in 150 pounds, and I think I still would have, All-American or made the finals. But, the mental aspect has always been my challenge, getting past that. And, again, I'm just grateful for everybody. The sport's a beautiful sport. No one's mastered the sport, and I'm just so excited for the future. And, 30 minutes ago I was talking to Mike, I want to forfeit this finals match. I don't care. And then, I thought of it for a little bit, and it's like, this is bigger than me, You got to be selfless, not selfish. And, again, I represent so much more than myself. I represent that whole Cornell crowd. And truly, if you're not a fan of me after this, man, it's like, oh, wow, then you weren't really ever a fan of me. If it takes me losing to be heartbroken over me, like, I can't say that you're one of my fans, or, that you really support me, because live, let or die. It's just like people who are there from the start love me no matter what, and it's just tough, Another great guy, Julian's right here. We got both Julians. We got cameraman Julian. We got Julian Ramirez, and shout out to Julian Ramirez. He's my best friend. He's my older brother. I'm start crying, dude. He got me through a lot this year. This year again was just. Really leaning on a lot of people, like I said, I don't know how many times I almost pulled out of this tournament, day before, 2 days before, some days I'm on cloud 9, I'm wrestling great, the next day I'm giving up one takedown at practice, and I'm like, I can't do this, and it's just, everyone's got their struggles, man, everyone goes through stuff, and it's just like, this year was a real struggle for me, and it just, and I don't want to keep this interview too long, I'm beating a dead horse, this year was tough, but again, like, yeah, this guy right here, Mike really got me through this year, Talk about family, not factory. That guy, truly, I think if I was at any other school, they would have, not kicked me out, but oh, you can sit this year, and then they would replace me, But Mike was just like, Mike put a lot of eggs in my basket and believed in me truly, and it's just, that's what it really means to be a part of a family, It's just, again, the quote is just like, I almost freaking died in the hospital, and it's scary when when your athletic director calls your trainer and they're like, how's he doing? They're like, we don't know. He's in a coma. We don't know what he's going to do. We don't know if he's going to wrestle. We don't know if he's going to ever wrestle again. Yeah, I appreciate you guys. I appreciate this tournament. It's a beautiful tournament. You know, as much as I wish I did better, as much as I don't want to get on that podium and put that 5th place on, it's a part of me. It's a part of the story. You know, there's a lot of wrestling in my future. You know, I'm happy I didn't, you know, fall all the way down. You know, wish I gave a little bit more in that K-Sag match, and I really wasn't. If you look at me, I don't even think I was really even tired. It kind of just, I don't know, just heartbreaking. This whole tournament was pretty heartbreaking, but again, just
Different weight class next year?
you know, as much as I want to wrestle 165, I could be a 49-pounder for all I want it to be, you know, and you know, some guys, you know, if they're taking steroids and they're not taking steroids, you know, wink, wink. It's just crazy, you know. I'm grateful that there's our athletic director right there. How you doing? Again, it's awesome, you know. I'm grateful that I am never a kid who's really cut weight, and I hope that other kids can look at it like that. You know, this sport doesn't have to be so bitter, you know. I felt like that way for a long time. I've been not angry at the sport. I love wrestling. It's just competing is the most beautiful part about this, you know. And, you know, the practice should be the hard, stressful part, but it's like that was always my most enjoyable. I always felt so free at practice. You know, I would come to tournaments like this and, you know, be so tight and so nervous, but it's just like it's such a gift that we get to compete, and you know, all of this is a gift. So I appreciate you guys. I don't want to keep you too much longer, you know, but I appreciate you guys.